Hello, and thank you for joining our webinar today, sponsored by the eAccess Forum. My name is Anastasia Papas, and I am the founder of the forum. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome Irene Monasterolo, who will present her paper with Maria Nieto and Edo Schetz, The Good, the Bad, and the Hothouse World, Conceptual Underpinnings of the NGFS Scenarios and Suggestions for Improvements. Irene is a professor of climate finance at EDHEC, at the EDHEC Business School, and research director of the Finance Impact on Climate Mitigation and Adaptation program at the EDHEC Risk Climate Impact Institute. Perfect economist to comment on the NGFS scenarios, since in 2017, with her co-authors, published the semi-social system that introduced the framework through which climate scenarios lead to adjustments in financial. This framework has been applied by several financial institutions, including the European Central Bank. Irene has collaborated with leading financial institutions, including the European Banking Authority, the European Insurance and Occupational and Pension Authority, and the G20 on climate financial risk disclosure and risk assessments. I am happy to have her back for another webinar. But before I pass the floor to Irene, I would like to invite you to take our short survey. So the first question is, are the NGFS scenarios sufficiently severe yet plausible scenarios of climate risk? And the second is, what is the main target audience for the NGFS scenarios? Okay. So for the first question, are the NGFS scenarios sufficiently severe yet plausible scenarios? 60% of the audience thought yes, they are. And for the second question, what is the main target audience for the NGFS scenarios? 50% of the audience thought policymakers, and 43% thought financial community. So with this information, Irene, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here again. And let's see if I can share my screen. And please confirm you can see. Okay, so I'm very happy today to present a paper that we recently published together with Maria Nieto from Banco de España and Edo Schetz from Bloomberg as a Banco de España working paper, and also in a shorter form as a SURF policy brief. The paper is titled The Good, the Bad, and the Hothouse World, Conceptual Underpinnings of the NGFS Scenarios and Suggestion for Improvement. What do we do here? Well, basically, we do an analysis, a critical review of the climate mitigation scenarios developed by the Network for Green the Financial System and applied for climate financial risk assessment already in several jurisdictions. And we focus on some key elements like sources of uncertainty, treatment of physical and transition risk, and cross-model comparisons, as well as within model comparison. And we provide some recommendations for improvement. Indeed, the NGFS scenarios are not static, but are, let's say, a living animal, and the new version will be published already in July this year. Going one step back, so what motivates our analysis? You might be aware that in the last decade, in particular since the launch of the Paris Agreement in 2015, there's been a growing awareness by central banks, financial supervisors, and overall investors and decision makers in finance about the macro-financial criticalities of climate physical and transition risk. In particular, in 2015, Mark Carney, the former governor of Bank of England, in his speech about the tragedy of the horizons at Lloyd's of London, identified the climate physical transition and mitigation risk as main driver of climate risk for finance, warning the financial sector about the importance to assess and be prepared to manage such risk. In 2017, we introduced, together with co-authors in a publication on Nature Climate Change, the climate stress test, a methodology for climate stress testing the financial system, considering indeed that climate risks are forward-looking, and thus we need to work with scenarios. The scenarios at that time were the scenarios reviewed every 7 years by the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, which served as a basis also for the scenarios of the NGFS that we will discuss today. In 2020, a group that now collects over 144 authorities in the net of greening the financial system launched the first set of climate scenarios that aim to support investors and financial authorities in assessing climate-related financial risk. These scenarios are based on and are co-developed with climate scientists and climate economists of the process-based integrated assessment modeling communities. In particular, 3 process-based integrated assessment models are used, so GCAM, Message, Globion, Remind, McPy. These scenarios, as we mentioned before, have been updated through time, and the new vintage will be out in July this year. And they have been already applied not only in academic exercises, but also by several central banks and regulators in their climate stress tests, including, for instance, Banque de France, the ACPR, the European Central Bank, the Austrian National Bank, and last year by over 100 banks in Europe in the ECB guided climate stress test exercise. There are, however, some limitations that the literature already highlighted about the NGFS scenarios that, let's say, weaken their role for financial risk assessment. On the one hand, in 2021, together with Stefano Battistone, Keiwan Riai, and Bas van Rooyen, we published a paper in Science showing the fact that the scenarios still lack the role of finance, and in particular miss the critical interplay between investors' expectations and climate policy credibility. And what we show there by integrating these dimensions, so the dimension of climate sentiments, we show that integrating investors' expectations and the translation in adjustment in risk assessment and cost of capital in the NGFS scenarios, trajectories could lead to very different orderly and disorderly transition scenarios with major implications then for financial supervision, but also for investors' risk management. On the other hand, in 2022, in a publication for the World Bank, together with Nicola Ranger and Olivier Mahoul, we show that we focused on physical risk, and we show that the scenarios have a slightly very limited representation of acute risk and neglect the compounding of risk, for instance, of hazards with pandemics, which is what we witnessed in the last 3 years. And overall, these issues leads to lower shocks than what we would expect. What is this paper about? We provide a comprehensive overview of the main characteristics of the NGFS scenarios, including limitations and discussion of opportunities for improvement. Why we do so? Because the NGFS scenarios are becoming a critical tool, not only for policymakers, just recalling your question, your survey, but also for central banks, financial supervisors, and investors in their climate stress test, as well as in the academic community. So it's crucial then to understand their characteristics and what they are and how to use them in order to use them properly in climate stress test and understand the meaning of results to support decision making. In this presentation, we focus on key uncertainties, on the role of representative concentration pathways and shared socioeconomic pathways in the scenario narratives, in the interpretation and sensitivities of carbon price pathways, in the comparison of the results among process-based integrated assessment models, so the three ones we mentioned before, and a comparison between the NGFS scenarios with other scenario providers, such as those provided, for instance, by the International Energy Agency, with an applications to the phasing out of fossil fuels. Starting from the basics, so what are NGFS scenarios and narratives? So these scenarios provide narratives of how the transition could occur, either orderly, disorderly, or never occurs, so the OTAS word, and discuss implications for transition and physical risk for finance, which are the boxes you see here on the right. It's so far there is a set of 6 scenarios. 2 orderly scenarios, which are net zero 2050, which is the most ambitious one. So you see a temperature target, meaning limiting global temperature increase above pre-industrial times by the end of the century to maximum 1.5 degrees. And as you might know, we already, the temperature already increased by 1+2 degrees in average, but in some areas, such as, for instance, in Switzerland or in Italy, it already increased by over 2 degrees. Then there is the another scenario, which is the one aligned with the Paris Agreement targets, so to limit, aim to limit global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees. In orderly scenarios are characterized by an early and credible introduction of climate policies, such as, for instance, carbon tax or carbon prices, meaning that in transition risk will be low because the carbon tax will be lower, so meaning lower cost of adjustment for the economy, and thus lower adjustment in asset prices and implications for portfolios, but also physical risk will be low because we do mitigation in time. In contrast, we have 2 scenarios of disorderly transition, which is what you see in the top box on the left. Divergent net zero aim to achieve 1.5 degrees and a delayed 2 degrees target. Disorderly transition scenarios are characterized by a late and sudden introduction of climate policies, such as, for instance, a carbon tax, meaning that with late, we mean after 2030, meaning that at that time, the carbon tax will have to be higher, particularly over $100 per ton, because in order to be still able to stay within the carbon budget, so how many emissions we can still put in the atmosphere in order to be able to achieve the 1.5 or 2 degrees targets. So this means that the cost of adjustments in the economy will be higher, and so potential losses for high carbon and fossil fuel activities, and which would reflect in adjustment in the value of assets. Meaning that transition risk in a disorderly scenario is high, but physical risk is still manageable because we do mitigation, just we do it later, so it will be more costly. At the opposite, we have OTAS worst scenarios, which are characterized either by current policies that countries are implementing or their pledges for nationally determined contributions. And we know well that this will not be enough to limit global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees. And according to the latest UNEP report, these efforts would allow us to stay barely below 3 degrees. And in this context, then transition risk is low because we don't really do the transition, but physical risk is really high. These scenarios, these narratives translate thanks to the three process-based integrated assessment models into trajectories of outputs by sector and energy technology from up to the end of the century. And here what you see plotted two examples of output trajectories. On the left, you see output of wind-based electricity, on the right of gas-based electricity across three different scenarios. The gray one is current policy, the blue one is net zero, and the green one is delayed transition. So what we see first is that we see the different trajectories. So we have an increase in all scenarios of wind-based electricity and a decrease in gas-based electricity. However, what matters for finance is the slope. And the more acute is the slope, for instance, what we see in the case of wind-based electricity for the delayed transition, but in particular for gas-based electricity in a delayed transition. So the more abrupt is the adjustment in the slope, the larger would be the adjustment in the output and thus in the asset prices. These trajectories are mapped using one of the three integrated assessment models, Riemann and Pi. Why are these trajectories useful? So how do we use them in order to do climate stress tests? Here you see a representation of the framework that we developed in 2017 for that. So we started on the top left with the emission concentration that would lead to different temperature targets. So the gray, so the green line represents RCP 2.6, so below 2 degrees target. These emissions targets are translated into output trajectories by sector and energy technology, as we saw right now, which then are translated into adjustment in firms' profits and financial valuation of the contracts and financial securities. Here, for instance, you have an example for corporate bonds. And from the adjustment in financial valuation, we then calculate the adjustment in the risk matrix of the portfolio of the investor who has invested in these securities. For instance, here you have a calculation of the climate value at risk, considering also network effects. So not only direct first round losses, but also second or third round losses from interconnectedness. Now, as you can see, the starting point of all these analyses for climate financial risk, climate adjusted financial valuation and climate stress tests are right NGFS scenarios. So it's crucial to understand what do they mean. We start from understanding what are the key uncertainties in the scenarios. And well, these are connected to the shared socioeconomic pathways, so SSPs, and representative concentration pathways, RCPs, that together represent a framework to explore mitigation pathways by standardizing assumptions across climate scenarios. SSPs, you have a representation here on the right from key references, so O'Neill et al. And Rie et al. 2017, show pathways of socioeconomic global changes up to the end of the century, which could occur either in a sustainable way, so fostering sustainability transition, which is SSP1, which is also called then taking the green road, meaning that in this context we have low challenges for adaptation and for mitigation, while at the opposite, we have the highest challenges for mitigation and adaptation in SSP3, where we have regional rivalries, so lack of coordination across country and more trade barriers and barriers to access to low carbon technologies. In the middle, we have SSP2, which is the middle of the road, meaning we go on with the efforts we have now and we try to foster low carbon transition in the economy. And SSP2 is characterized by average socioeconomic challenges for adaptation and for mitigation. And SSP2 is the one that actually is considered now in the NGFS scenarios. We have then on the top, SSP5, which is a fossil fuel-led development. So when we go on with fossil fuel exploration, and on the bottom right, we have SSP4, which is a world divide, so where we have differences between the north and the south in mitigation and adaptation. In contrast, RCPs, standardized temperature outcomes, and which are measured in terms of radiative forcing levels. They are called representative because each RCP provides only one of the many possible scenarios that would lead to a specific level of radiative forcing captured by the RCP. These are SSPs which send important assumptions for being narratives about how the world will develop. They have important assumptions about how GDP, population, and technology will adjust. And these assumptions, in turn, have a large impact on climate risk because they inform the projections of energy demand and countries' ability to absorb shocks, which are then used by the process-based integrated assessment models. The NGFS scenarios only consider two RCPs, so RCP 2.6 with temperature between 1.5 and 2 degrees, and Hottel's world scenario, with a high temperature scenario of RCP 6, so over 3 degrees. And as we mentioned before, they all consider only SSP 2. There are several limitations so far in SSP, which provide also opportunities for further developments. They were last updated in 2017, and they do not account for recent developments such as COVID crisis and geopolitical tensions, such as the war in Ukraine. Importantly, they don't account for the role of finance in the transition. So they consider GDP, population, technological developments, but not finance, while we know that this is could be a driver, but also a barrier for climate mitigation and adaptation if investors don't adjust expectations and risk assessment. Furthermore, if consumer preferences were to shift to lower energy demand, for instance, in line with SSP1, which is taking the green road, this would relax the need for strict climate policies and could thus reduce the potential transition impacts. And also they don't consider low demand scenarios. And finally, if investment and GDP trajectories would be more aligned instead with a more unequal world, so SSP4, the level of climate adaptation might suffer, leading to higher physical risk and vulnerabilities. The second point we want to discuss is the treatment of climate transition and physical risk. So transition risk is mostly represented by the introduction of carbon pricing, aimed to internalize the negative externalities of greenhouse gas emissions. So carbon prices impact production cost, prices, and production volumes. Carbon price is defined as the marginal abatement cost of an incremental ton of emissions in process-based integrated assessment models. So the marginal abatement cost curve is upward sloping, meaning that the cheapest to abate emissions are the first ones that are addressed, so the later, the more expensive. There is also a sectoral pace then of decarbonization, because sectors with the high marginal abatement cost decarbonize production early when the carbon price is high enough to match such costs. So there is economic opportunity cost to decarbonize. And regional marginal abatement cost curves differ across region, reflecting different costs for low carbon investing in low carbon technologies and different abatement progress and decarbonization progress. On the contrary, when it comes to physical risk, there are two types of risk considered. One is chronic risk, so for instance, long-term temperature increase or sea level rise or biodiversity losses. However, in the NGFS scenarios, the macroeconomic impacts from chronic physical risk are obtained with a damage function calculated by Calcul and Benz 2022, which plots the relation between climate variables such as temperature and regional GDP in order to inform GDP losses. However, these estimates are based on the historical relationship between these variables, while we know that the future will be much different, and how different depends on whether and to what extent we do mitigation and adaptation now. So basically, these estimates are highly conservative, and mostly, since they are at the regional level, they tend to average shocks, average localized shocks. When it comes to acute risk mostly are hazards, climate-related hazards, so droughts, storms, hurricanes, and they are informed by, on the one hand, by database, public available database by EasyMIP, which provides impact of hazards on agricultural yields, and by the catastrophe risk model Climata. There is a lot of work to do to foster still the understanding and representation of physical and transition risk, and this connects to the first question in your survey: are shocks severe enough? Well, on the end of the transition risk, the implied carbon prices used in the process-based integrated assessment model do not distinguish between levies on greenhouse gas emissions, for instance, via a tax or a cap and trade system, or the introduction of other forms of environmental regulation and subsidies, which work via different channels and thus have different impacts in entry points and impact in the economy, and thus different channels of signaling to economic agents. Second, the potential trade-offs of different climate policy tools are not captured yet, and thus the policy impacts could be under or overstated, and overall the potential co-benefits of policies could be neglected in the current setting. The third point is that carbon prices are assumed to generate fiscal revenues that are included in the general budget of each country or region. But we know that in reality, it might be hard or even impossible for countries to use these revenues to, for instance, support low carbon or renewable energy investments. So they might be a bit optimistic. When it comes instead to physical risk, there is a limited consideration of acute physical risk within the economic projections, and in particular, the impacts of physical risk in the economy that then trigger the need for climate policy. And this is linked to the fact that acute impacts are only made available for tropical cyclones, which are not relevant for all regions in the world, for instance, consider Europe, and for pluvial floods. Second, the macroeconomic impacts from chronic physical risk, so for instance, long-term temperature change, don't account for future impacts of climate change that are not captured in historical data, for instance, leaving all the issues about non-linearities and tipping points out. But we know also from recent research that this matters. There was a new publication on Nature about the update of the planetary boundary out only a few days ago. And finally, the damages from sea level rise and non-market damages such as loss of life, conflicts and violence, and biodiversity and ecosystem damages are not captured yet. So overall, what we have now is a would say a conservative representation of the shocks. Let's look at how the NGFS scenarios now compare with other scenarios providers. Indeed, it all started with the IPCC scenarios, but there are also the scenarios provided by the International Energy Agency. And in order to know which scenario to use and for what, we need to know how they compare and their characteristics. And here we have a table 1 that summarizes the differences among NGFS, IEA, and IPCC scenarios in terms of audience, underlying models, and scope across transition, physical risk, and overall macroeconomic variables. So the IPCC, the main target audience is the academic and policy community. The model used are process-based integrated assessment models, a larger number of such models than the ones used by the NGFS, and climate models. There are transition pathways, there are physical risk, but represented with different granularity given a category, but there are no macroeconomic pathways. In contrast, NGFS scenarios, the main target is the finance community, meaning not only investors, central banks, and financial supervisors, but also academics working in finance. And the models used are three process-based integrated assessment models. So we mentioned them before: GChem, Remind, McPie, and Message Globiome. There are climate models, particularly CLIMADA for physical risk, for acute physical risk, and macroeconomic models, which is NIGEM, a macroeconomic model to translate the scenarios into GDP outcomes. There are transition pathways, there are physical risk, despite the limitations we discussed before, and there are macroeconomic pathways which are represented by, which are elaborated by NIGEM, and more recently also there is discussion with another model. And finally, with the International Energy Agency, the main target audience are mainly decision makers, in particular policy makers. They are based on energy system models. They do represent transition pathways, but they don't have physical risk nor macroeconomic pathways. Now, let's look at an application of how do they differ where we run a specific scenario. So we focus here on the net zero scenario and providing a comparison of how net zero is represented across these three families of scenarios. So we have on the NGFS, the net zero 2050, which is represented here with then the International Energy Agency Net Zero NZE 2050, and the projection of 1.5 degrees with no or limited overshoot, which has been used in the IPCC report 2018. So the yellow is the International Energy Agency scenario, while the red one is GChem, the blue one is Message Globiome, the green one is Remind McPie, which have been analyzed within, used by the NGFS. So these three, red, blue, green dots represent the NGFS scenarios treatment, and in comparison overall to the IPCC 1.5 degrees report. So starting from the left, we have exajoules per year, then we have in final energy in exajoule per year, then in the middle we have the shares of wind and solar in electricity generation, and on the right we have the carbon capture storage in gigatons of CO2 per year by 2050. So what we see in terms of final energy demand is that GChem and Message in 2015 are just below the IPCC median. Moving instead to the central box plot, what we see is that in terms of solar and wind derived energies, the three process-based integrated assessment models, so the green, red, and blue dots, project a higher share for these renewables, meaning that in these models they are relatively more cost efficient than in the IPCC, and that the IEA net zero sits centrally between these three IAM results and the IPCC results. And finally, we have a representation of the carbon capture, storage and use on the right. And what we see here is that the IEA net zero scenario, so the yellow one, is just above the 25th percentile by the IPCC, and overall within the NGFS range, which is quite broad. If you consider the red dot, which is GChem, which is larger use, and message, which is the least use. And here instead we look at a comparison of the NGFS and IEA scenarios when we consider scenarios of phasing out of fossil fuels. So again, the color line, yellow is the IEA, red one is GChem, the blue one is message, and the green one is Remind-McPy for three fossil fuels. On the left, we have coal, in the middle, we have gas, and on the right, we have oil, and these are all in volume. So starting from coal, we see that the demand rapidly declines in all the three process-based integrated assessment models and gets negligible, in particular for message and remind, by 2050. And the IEA scenario sits in the middle. In contrast, for gas, well, some of these trajectories we already saw before when we discussed about the output trajectory of the NGFS, which were calculated with Remind-McPy in the previous charts. So what we see here is that the IEA projects higher demand in the short term, but then a rapid fall by after 2030, while in contrast, the opposite, we have lowest demand for gas by Remind-McPy. Different, similar starting point and final point for GChem and message, but different trajectories with larger fall for message GloBio. And finally, we have oil, where we have two striking results and differences. So on the one hand, we have the sharpest fall in message GloBiome, and instead a later and more gradual fall in oil volume estimated by GChem, while the IEA scenario mostly mimics the message results, while Remind estimates sits in the middle. So, having as an overview on the characteristics of the scenarios and their comparison with other scenarios providers, we came up with 5 suggestions for improvement of NGFS scenarios. The first suggestion is about timely revision of SSPs assumptions to keep trace of the impact of geopolitical and socioeconomic crises, including inflation, which is still with us and probably still for some time. Second, the importance to consider the role of finance in the development and implementation of the SSPs narratives, because the finance is critical for scaling up capital, but also for divesting from fossil fuels, and expectations in finance are crucial for that. And the third suggestion for regarding the SSP assumption is to foster the standardization of technological assumptions across them in order to enhance the comparability and being able even to isolate the role of technological developments in them. The second set of recommendations suggests the treatment of climate policies, and in particular, we suggest process-based integrated assessment models to be extended to capture the impact of specific policy tools and their implementation, so beyond simple carbon pricing, and consider also the trade-offs in terms of across sectors and regions of introducing such policy tools, and the potential implications of for fiscal cost and the use of revenues that so far are just are not critically discussed and implemented. The third set of recommendations regards the importance to foster the comparison among scenarios providers, and in particular to develop a framework to compare climate scenarios, because this would allow users to decide which brand of scenarios to use given their purpose and their needs, but also to build a plausible distribution of future outcomes of the scenarios based on comparable inputs and outputs. So being able to also exploit the strengths of the different approaches used by different scenarios providers, and understand why results on scenarios output differ, to what extent they are driven by their models, by their assumptions, and so on. And this, what we presented today, is the first attempt to do so. So there is still really much work to be done. The fourth set of recommendations consists in the strengthening of the representation of physical risk, both in terms of chronic impacts, so going beyond simplistic damage function, and the integration of a better representation of acute physical risk and the interaction between chronic and acute risk, as well as the interaction between physical and transition risk, because these two concepts are interdependent. So the more we delay the introduction of climate policies and thus mitigation, the higher the physical risk. So these two types of risk should not be considered in two different frameworks, but within the same framework, because they are interconnected and they both affect the macroeconomic and financial outcomes of the scenarios. And finally, talking about finance, it's time for a process-based integrated assessment model to account for finance and investors' climate sentiments, because integrating the interplay between investors' expectation, climate policy credibility, and investment trajectories matters, as we showed in research, and is crucial to develop more realistic scenarios, which are then more relevant for decision-making in climate finance. And with this, I conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a very interesting presentation. I would like to remind the audience that you can put your questions on the Q&A function. There are already a couple of questions. One is why you haven't compared the NGFS scenarios with the inevitable policy response?
Well, actually, we took the more, let's say, well-established set of scenarios providers. So something that was going on along for time already.
Another
but
question.
Of course, we could stand and do that. Yes.
Another question is asking if you can address a temperature overshoot. I guess how it's being...
Well, temperature overshoots are being considered already by the process-based integrated assessment models. So there was some discussion about this at the last COP27. We didn't focus on this because we have still very little evidence in publications.
So, and next question, could you explain to what extent the interplay between transition risk and physical risk is covered by the NGFS scenarios? It seems this was attempted in the integrated damages model versions for Remind MACPI.
Well, that's a very important question, and the extent is very limited, so they are working on it, but, and indeed, this is the example that you mentioned, but when you then go there and plot the variables, there are very few variables available, and also the results are quite, let's say, awkward in terms of impacts on GDP. And so this is for sure a point on which the NGFS should really strengthen the work. Also, in order to limit one of the main challenges that we see now, so the fact that shocks, so we have large output adjustments and output shocks. I showed you before for wind energy or gas-based electricity, but then what happens is that these sectoral output shocks are elaborated in a macroeconometric model that then actually smooths the overall shocks on GDP. And this is because of lower sectoral disaggregation and different assumptions on agents' behaviors and so on. So that's overall another main issue to address, and which is discussed also in the paper. Now, for sake of time, we didn't go in details in the discussion of macro models, but for those interested in, we have reference in the paper.
I actually have a question to ask. The NGFS scenarios highlight the trade-off between physical and transition risks, and you just told us that it's important to further explore this sort of trade-off, to take into consideration, feedback loops, et cetera, et cetera. The Federal Reserve's pilot climate scenario analysis is structured, along two separate modules. One addresses the physical risks, and they use the analysis from the IPCC. And the other one, the transition risks, and they use the scenarios from the NGFS. And the justification is that this simplification makes it easier for the banking sector to identify the critical data, the model, the risk management. So I was wondering if you could comment on why this sort of different approach.
Well, indeed, it's a kind of, I was also surprised when I read the Fed report. Let's say that I was also surprised because it's rather not consistent with the practice that has been developed so long. I mean, at least in the last decade in Europe, where central banks and regulators, but also academia, really push forward on the use of scenarios for climate stress tests. The fact is that the sum of the shocks is not just so the overall impact that could happen in the economy when we consider physical and transition risk is not just the sum of the two elements, and meaning that if we treat physical and transition risk separately, first it's conceptually really strange, because we know that if we don't do mitigation, we have larger physical risk and also larger need for adaptation finance and larger shocks. So it's it ends up treating them separately leads to kind of inconsistent messages, I believe, that then and also in, let's say, overall much smaller shocks than what we still see now, we see now, which are already quite limited. For instance, last year, we published an analysis of the double materiality of climate risk for the euro area economy and banking sector, using the same NGFS scenarios definition as vintage as the ECB used in its climate stress test 2024. And what we saw is that just by changing the macroeconomic model that elaborates the scenarios, you can get up to double size of the shock on GDP, which in our case went up to over 13% by 2050 for the euro area. Yet considering all the discussion we had about the fact that NGFS scenarios are conservative in their representation of transition and physical risk. So there are already several challenges that we will need to address, and it's very important to be consistent and coherent with a framework that allows us to capture the characteristics of climate change, which is not just another type of risk. So we have just been a lot of discussion about this, a lot of papers written about the peculiarity of climate risk, so nonlinearity, deep uncertainty, endogeneity, which then gets back to the fact why we need physical and transition risks together in the same framework.
So the availability of raw materials such as lithium still remains one of the main bottlenecks in the energy transition. What do you think about including raw material in intensity of the renewable energy in comparison to the mainstream energy?
Well, it will for sure improve our understanding of much effort we need to get there, and also on the input-output representation of what is available in terms of raw materials to make the transition to a low-carbon economy, and the potential sources, also the regional representation and of these sources and availability. And this would impact also on the cost sensitivity of renewable energy. So yeah, it will be important to do so.
So there's a clarification question. Do NGFS scenarios have breakdown by country and region?
Yes, they are.
I think you mentioned it during your presentation. One last question. What are you seeing financial institutions doing now? Presumably they can't wait for improvements in the scenarios. Are you seeing any improvements emerging, say, from banks or investment funds as to how they use scenarios themselves?
So let's clarify. So the NGFS scenarios are further developing, but the way in which to use them, so how to translate the concepts in and the narratives in output variables, and how to integrate the output variables into adjustment in prices of contracts and securities, so adjustment in probability of default, LGD, or value at risk. It's, I mean, the structure is the same. So it's absolutely important to have this framework in place for both central banks and financial institutions, but also for academics, because risk management matters in finance. This is what we keep on seeing every 2 or 3 years, you know, and stress test matters, and stress test work with scenarios. And in this context, we work with the climate scenario. So it's important to be able to manage the framework and to understand what drives results in the adjustment, for instance, your PD, LGD, or value at risk, depending on your mandate or on your goal. And being able to understand the NGFS scenarios and use them, it's fundamental, no matter then how some specificities would change in the NGFS scenarios. The structure will be there, will be the same.
I don't see any other questions in Q&A. So thank you very much, Irene. It was a very interesting presentation, and thank you all for joining us today. We have another webinar coming up on June 19th, and it's organized by the Young Scholars Committee. Anushka has put on chat the title of the paper, and I hope to see you then. Thank you very much. Again, maybe we got one last.
Thank you so much, everybody, and also my co-authors. I see Maria here.
Thank you. Okay, bye-bye.